Welcome back to Free Media. I'm Robby Soave.
And I'm Andrew Heaton. Bernie Sanders returned to the Joe Rogan Experience. The leftist Democrat was previously endorsed by the podcasting giant in 2020, though Rogan has drifted rightward since then, endorsing Trump in 2024. When Sanders accused Elon Musk of spending hundreds of millions of dollars to elect Trump, Rogan interrupted him to point out that Kamala Harris was not exactly shy about taking money from rich people. Let's watch.
So you don't like Bernie Sanders? You can put millions or hundreds of millions of dollars into a campaign and express your view about how terrible Bernie Sanders is,
right.
And you can buy that election, right? That's your constitutional right. I think that's probably the worst decision that the Supreme Court has ever made. So what is the result of that decision? The result of that decision, let's take us to where we are today, is that Elon Musk, and I know Elon was on your show, and he's here in Austin, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, and we could talk about Elon, but he spent $270 million to elect Trump as president. Okay, I think that's absurd that any one person.
What's the most someone donated towards the Harris campaign?
They spent a lot of money on Harris as well.
They spent $1.5 billion just
combined
over the course of a couple of months.
You got it. All right, let me talk about it. So I'm not here just to say it's a Republican. That's my point here.
Right.
Okay. So Musk spends that money. And what's his reward? He becomes the most powerful person in government for 3 or 4 months. Okay, fine.
Even aside from the thing that Joe Rogan pointed out there, which is, well, both sides have tons of very wealthy people spending money to help get them into power because government is vast and powerful and can do a lot. And when the stakes are very high, people with a lot on the line are going to spend money to get involved in politics. My solution here is to make the government have less power over our lives, and then people wouldn't spend so much money trying to control it. But the first part of that, where Bernie is kind of like sarcastically saying, well, yeah, because of this decision, now you can spend billions to defeat Bernie Sanders. Your impression, I've been told, is better, so we'll get that in a moment. Okay. You're a trained actor, so it probably is better. Well, yes, that is the point. The point of the decision, Citizens United, is that you can't fundamentally untangle money from speech. And in fact, the decision itself was about a company that made a film, a documentary about Hillary Clinton that the government tried to say they couldn't show because it was too close to the election and violated the law. And before the Supreme Court asked, well, what if it was a book? And the government said, yeah, we could suppress it if it was a book as well. And then the Supreme Court said, well, there goes that law then. Sorry, Bernie.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think the sort of the standard boilerplate position of the Bernie folks is that people are buying elections by being able to dump huge amounts of money. More specifically, billionaires are able to do it. I agree with you. In the United States, we've got very strong freedom of speech laws, which I applaud and am enthusiastically in favor of. And it's very difficult to say, I, Andrew Heaton, in an election year, cannot make a movie about zoning. If I happen to implicate somebody, go, this person is a NIMBY, they are bad on zoning. So you have to make concessions for that if we're going to have campaign finance reform. Then you could get sneaky with it too. Like if somebody went, all right, you can only donate, up to $400 or whatever the thing is, $2,000, right? Okay, no problem. Can I run a political action committee that's just designed at civic education? That's all I'm doing, by the way. All I'm trying to do is I just want more people to vote. I'm going to do voter drives. I happen to know where all the Republicans live, and I'm just going to go to their neighborhood and push it. Or alternately, I'm going to go to university campuses if I want Democrats to get elected. But all I'm doing is trying to get people registered. I think it's very difficult at that point to be able to extricate the freedom of expression from the campaign finance. But beyond that, yes, it's a lot of money that goes into all of this. I think people lose perspective. The amount of money that we spent on the 2020 election was about what we spent on Halloween that year. It turns out there's all sorts of frivolous bullshit we spend money on.
What were you for Halloween last year? Do you remember? I was Anakin Skywalker. And I think
I was King George III last year.
Awesome.
I think I put on
like the Hamilton,
the Hamilton version. Oh yeah, I love that song.
It's
I love that song.
Actually, it's the only thing I like about the musical, honestly.
Yes, I agree. So that's part. There's a perspective issue, but then there's also just. I'm not convinced that the quid quo pro is actually happening that people think is happening. If we go back to 2016 when Trump enters the arena, Trump is outspent at every point in the election by his opponents. Yes. So when you're looking at him in the primaries, at each point where he's got a contender, he's underspending the people that he's going against, and he underspends Hillary Clinton, which is, I think, the accidental, unforeseen consequence. If we actually were to enact some of these more stringent campaign finance laws, you're going to get a lot more Donald Trumps. Because there's nothing to stop me, a politician, from saying crazy bullshit to get attention on camera. Now, right now, Andrew Heaton, who am fairly limp-wristed cut character, I can go to various donors and go, well, I'm going to make a pretty good play for the upzoning, and they might give me money. But like, if I don't have that, I'm going to come out and go, I will hang Rosie O'Donnell from a tree.
Yes.
And then, that's crazy bullshit. Let's give him more attention. So you're going to get more Trumps if you do this.
Well, because the media attention is what matters so much. And then what is the difference between giving money directly to a candidate or to a campaign and, for instance, buying a major media platform and changing its editorial line to be more friendly to the candidate, as obviously Elon did on behalf of Trump with Twitter X. But also just media companies do endorsements. Mm-hmm. The New York Times, in this recent mayoral race, did a really backhanded and cowardly, if I am to be honest, quasi-endorsement of Cuomo over Mamdani. And that, if you think that the Times matters at all, which I do think it does, unfortunately it does, why are they allowed to do that, but Burger King couldn't give money to, whoever's Cuomo's campaign, whoever it is, because they believe in that? What differentiates the New York Times from a different corporation or different media outlet or someone? It's just a group of people practicing their speech. I think you ideologically, philosophically, can't untangle those concepts. And so, what can you do?
Well, I think that was the other part of Citizens United, right? Which is that aggregated individual rights, when aggregated, did not go away. Yeah. So if you and I both have individual rights in terms of freedom of speech, and we form
the Cut Company,
sponsored by lizard people for Robby, we are permitted to do that. Yeah. But I want to run by you something. I talked to Larry Summers a couple of years ago, and he's very much in favor of campaign finance reform. I think he would concede a lot of Citizens United, or at least that's the reality of where we are. What he pitched to me was not restricting your end as the donor in terms of your freedom of speech, but rather the recipients. So I as a somebody that really wants to influence elections, I can do an unlimited amount of spending, but I can't do them at the same place. So I can do 1,000 there, 1,000 there, but I have to distribute it. So from his perspective, you're not limiting the speech that anybody does in terms of their money, but you are limiting the recipients in order to try to negate the power of the PACs. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I guess I'd have to think about that further. That would probably be not as bad, but I think still would run into the same fundamental problem as just the policy in general. Before we moved on, I wanted to talk about one other aspect of that long interview that Bernie did with Joe Rogan, talking about minimum wage, where he got Joe Rogan to agree that the minimum wage ought to be higher. Now, I think he's talking about the federal minimum wage, which never makes a lot of sense to me because what your dollar can purchase is dramatically different in different parts of the country. So I don't know how you could possibly have one minimum wage for the same one for a city like Los Angeles or New York City, and have the same one for people who live in rural Nebraska.
There's more economic variance between between the wealthiest county in America, which I think is up in Northern California, versus the poorest county, which is in Mississippi. There's more variance between them than there is between the GDP of Brazil and the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. So if you think it would be a bad idea for the UK and Brazil to agree upon a minimum wage, it would likewise be a bad idea in the United States. I'm with you completely on that. And the other thing I would add, because I've had this conversation so many times now where I talk to my friends and I'm like,
you have so many liberal friends.
I have so many liberal. I'm very likable.
Yeah. That's the difference between you and I guess.
Yeah,
so people say, aren't you and Andrew Heaton a little too similar to be doing a show
like,
together?
Odious. I'm odious.
But people hate me and they like him.
I'll talk to them and I'm like, first of all, I don't want anybody to be poor. I don't like poverty. I don't want anybody to be. I'm very much on team helping people, right?
You take the monocle out of your eye, put the top hat down.
Price controls are not a good way to help people. Price controls really don't work very well, even if we're applying them to labor. We don't get to pick and choose what economics applies to based on what we feel. And with minimum wage, the thing that I tend to run into is I'll go through the whole thing that we would agree on of you're outlawing labor below X threshold. It's going to put people, and people will always go like this. Heaton, if you grew up in a underserved community, and I'm like, okay, let's just flip it. We're talking where you're like, cancer's really bad, so we need to prescribe Cialis. And I'm like, I don't think Cialis is going to cure cancer. And you're like, if you grew up in a cancer-ridden community, you would understand why it's so important to give everybody Cialis. And I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not arguing it's bad. I'm telling you it's not going to work very well. I don't think it would work very well. The minimum wage is always zero. That's the real minimum wage. What you're doing is you've got a step ladder, and you're going, oh, that bottom rung on the stepladder is awful. Let's kick that out. It's gone. We did it. We solved it. Now everybody that can't get on the ladder is screwed. You've not actually solved the problem. You've just eliminated labor between zero and whatever the minimum wage is. If you're close to that rung, if you're like 90% of the way there, it probably helps you. You're good enough that you're going to get a little bit of pay come. If you're below that 50% threshold, within that, you're just not going to get a job. And so
the first thing I see when media companies in particular unionize is they try to get minimum pay standards in place that would preclude the company from hiring anyone new to compete with the existing staff. Yeah. Because oftentimes in this industry specifically, it's hard to know whether somebody's going to work out for the position. And you can take a chance on someone at when I started out in media 15-ish years ago now, I was paid like so little. It is hysterical to me now, but because they had no idea if I was any good, and I kind of wasn't. But I learned from doing the job. If you had to start me off at anything approaching like the average salary or anything approaching my current salary, I would have never made it in media. So that's a real world example.
In my stand-up career,
yes.
the
minimum wage for libertarian comedians. Does Dave Smith set the boundary for what that wage is supposed to be?
The first 14 of the 15 years I've done comedy would have put everybody in war crimes for how much I was paid. The other thing I'd add is I invoked Scandinavia in our last discussion, Robby, and Scandinavia doesn't have minimum wage. Now, they do have a kind of minimum wage, but it's through collective bargaining. It's not a government fiat. Yeah. If you go to Switzerland doesn't have a national minimum wage. They have a canton by canton minimum wage, which basically like county by county, which is a whole lot of variance, not a big national thing. You can't even do it in Switzerland. But in Scandinavia, what they do where they have it is you'll have sectoral bargaining. So there'll be the grocers union, and the grocers union will negotiate with the grocery store owners, which is a way smarter way to do it also because different industries have different profit margins. Software is about a 15% profit margin. Grocery stores have about a 2% profit margin. So unfortunately, because math always applies even when need is present, if you drive up labor beyond the 2% profit margin, you're done. You go out of business. So they do have it, but they're not doing it through government. They're doing it through collective bargaining, which I'm fine with. Yeah. I'm perfectly fine with people forming unions.
As long as it's not coercive or government backed up, then it's fine.
If you want to form a club or a union or whatever, and you're going to negotiate with the powers that be, go for it. But it's very different than the government outlawing labor below a certain threshold.
Indeed. Although we want to keep all those would-be libertarian journalists and comedians down and suppressed and not competing with us.
And like right now, hold on. Here, I would make it a law where we have enough we have enough white male comedians and podcasters.
For sure.
We should grandfather in the existing people.
/ magicians.
But everybody else, though, no, we need to hear more diverse voices. So no more white guys get to talk on the internet for like 10, 15, till I'm dead.
Whole shutdown on that until we know what's going on. Thanks for watching Free Media. We will have more for you first thing tomorrow morning.